Clerk, please call the roll.
All right. Councilmember Rouse.
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss.
Here.
And Councilmember Murillo.
Here.
Thank you.
All righty, so we're dealing with the emergency shelter zoning, and would you please proceed? Yes. Is it? It's the light's on. The light. Am I on? It's on. It's on. The light's on. I don't know.
Testing. I don't think we got mics on.
I don't think we have. Is there a doctor in the house? Yeah. Is that, are we?
Nothing. I'm work on my.
Yeah. Oh, there we are.
Yeah.
Now we got it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kathy, did you do that?
The youth council plays with it. That's how I know.
The mayor pro tem is in the house. Okay, please proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Today, your committee will consider ordinance amendments related to the emergency shelter zoning as required by state law, Senate Bill 2, and forward your proposed amendments to the Planning Commission for their review and subsequently to the City Council for introduction and adoption. Senate Bill 2 was enacted in 2007. And this legislation was designed to encourage and facilitate emergency shelters. And the Senate bill also requires that zoning be provided, which would allow at least one year-round emergency shelter by right. All jurisdictions are required to implement this requirement, this mandate. Also, this zoning needs to be in place, at least for us, before our city housing element update is certified, and we anticipate that to occur in February of 2015. In November of last year, your city council, or the city council, discussed Senate Bill 2, and in particularly, they discussed certain options that could implement this bill. City Council voted to allow emergency shelters by right in zones that currently permit overnight accommodations. And the slide here lists the zones that currently do that. Council also directed the preparation of ordinance amendments to implement this approach. The 4 zones that are listed on this slide, staff is recommending that they not be included as part of these amendments. The HRC 1 and 2, and that is hotel and related commerce, are in the coastal zone. And currently, our local coastal program is being updated. Certification is not anticipated for another 2 years. And because our zoning for emergency shelters has to be in place prior to that, the timing is problematic. So we are recommending that those 2 zones be eliminated from the ordinance amendments. The RH zone is specific to the zoning for the El Encanto Hotel. And there are no other parcels zone RH, so we're also recommending that zone be eliminated. The OC and the OM1 zones, again, are in the coastal zone, and they currently do not allow hotel use unless a CUP or a conditional use permit is obtained. So that doesn't really meet the intent of SB 2, so we are recommending that those 2 zones be eliminated as well, and that was addressed in your staff report. This map shows or depicts the zones that would allow or are proposed to allow emergency shelters by right. As you can see in the legend, it includes the R4, which is the hotel, motel, and multiple residential unit zone, and C1, limited commercial, C2, commercial, CL, limited commercial as well, CM, commercial manufacturing, CP, restricted commercial, and M1, light manufacturing. So this map highlights the zones where emergency shelters would be allowed by right.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. Since we're losing OC and OM1, but they're not charted on this map?
They are not. We did remove them from this
Well,
map.
I'm just wondering if it was a large area, or maybe it didn't cover that much area.
Actually, I do have some copies of that map for you. I didn't have it on this PowerPoint, so I can.
I'm just curious if we're losing a lot of space where one of these shelters could go into. I understand the reasoning that they don't allow hotel uses by right, so I get that. Just wondering about the area.
Right, and they're basically located in this area here and in here. So you'll notice on the map, I don't remember exactly the color, but I think, thank you, it's a pink color, and also a light blue, which is really hard to distinguish actually from the CM zone, which is right in here. And
I see.
and then the kind of another blue that's a little different than this, a gray blue.
No, this map shows it's a small area, so
Yes.
thank you. I
Yes,
appreciate
it's not as
the clarification. Thank you.
As a follow-up to Ms. Murillo's question, so in your earlier part of the presentation, also because the LCP won't be complete in time for this certification to go through,
that also
the
applies
main
to these
driver for this?
particular zones as well. What was driving these, the OC and the OM1 is that they don't allow hotel by right. They allow it with a conditional use permit. All the rest of the zones do allow it.
So
And-
this wouldn't override that, the conditional use permit requirement for the zone, this type of zoning? Because this.
Right, we would need to amend those particular zoning districts to allow it by right.
Okay.
And not by conditional use permit.
Right, thank you.
And that
So
becomes
matters.
problematic because it also requires an LCP amendment, certification by the Coastal Commission, and the timing just isn't doable.
Thank you.
The proposed ordinance amendments that are before you this afternoon add a definition of emergency shelter with minimal supportive services, which is the definition that is in Senate Bill 2 and actually part of the Health and Safety Code. And it is included in the proposed amendments as new section or subsection 28.04.273. Also, as part of these amendments, the standards that have been developed to regulate the operation and management of the emergency shelters are included in all the identified zones under the uses permitted section. And so each zone that will allow this by right will have all the standards outlined or called out in the specific zone. It also amends section 28.94.03.W, which is in the conditional use permits chapter, and that is to clarify which emergency shelters would not be allowed by right. In other words, which would require a conditional use permit. And those would be emergency shelters that have supportive services beyond what is allowed by the definition of the emergency shelter. And, for example, Casa Esperanza and the rescue mission would not be considered a shelter or a homeless shelter with minimal supportive services, or Salvation Army for that matter.
So does that mean that they're excluded from this discussion for that reason then, in terms of the inventory of available beds per the intent of this legislation?
Well, they would not be able to apply this particular program. However, we would count their beds as part of our need for the housing element.
So just to clarify, in other words, these existing shelters would require a conditional use permit because they have more than minimal supportive services, and that's what the new definition for emergency shelter is.
But the beds do count into the inventory as far as accredited
Absolutely,
state.
absolutely.
Thank you.
The law does allow for standards to be applied to emergency shelters. Although they may be required by right, there are standards that may be applied as long as they're reasonable and objective. And the SB 2 specifies that they must promote the creation of emergency shelters. In other words, they shouldn't be so restrictive. The standards should not be so restrictive or onerous that it wouldn't encourage the creation or the development of an emergency shelter. Again, the standards should not impede the development of this or operation of a shelter. And standards that we apply to these shelters should also match those that are currently applied to uses in the same zone. In other words, if they're in the R4 zone, then standards that we would apply to residential uses in the R4 zone would be applied to these particular uses as well. And here we have some examples. For instance, the lot area requirement, the height, the setbacks, those kind of things would still be applied as we do now. You received a copy of this table because it's so small on the screen, but this table reflects research that staff did with respect to other emergency homeless shelters in the area or in the city to inform our development of the standards that would be applied to emergency shelters that fall under the SB 2 requirements. And so, as you can see from the chart, Casa Esperanza, Rescue Mission, Transition House, we research what they provide now in terms of services and the number of beds that they currently have, the type of beds, transitional versus emergency, the parking that they currently have, how they came about to the parking standard that they have, the length of stay, and so forth. So this particular information helped us to craft the standards that we're proposing as part of these amendments. And the standards that we are proposing for these amendments include what is listed here on this slide. I'm going to go into them in more detail, but basically, again, it's the capacity, the length of stay, how waiting and intake areas would be provided, the type of outdoor activities, or at least where and how, parking, lighting, concentration of uses, on-site management, and ability to pay. With respect to capacity, based on our need, the homeless need that has been determined in our current housing element, we are proposing that the R4 zone, which is a residential zone, allow or limit the number of beds to 50 maximum beds. And in the commercial zones, the maximum capacity would be up to 100 beds. The length of stay, 6 months or less, and this is according to state law, that's the definition, or up to 6 months is what they allow. And with respect to intake areas, the proposed amendments would require that 10 square feet of floor area per bed be provided for these type of areas. This is to provide adequate space in the facilities in order to be able to not have the intake process spill out into the outdoors, and that it's required that these areas be provided inside. With respect to outdoor areas and activity, the outdoor areas shall be screened from public view. Queuing in the public right-of-way or parking areas would not be permitted. Outdoor activity policies would be addressed in the management plans that would be required for these facilities. Parking would be based on demonstrated need, and this would be determined through a parking study. We noticed that when researching the other shelters, all of the shelters had parking requirements based on their need through a parking demand study. And so we would be requiring that for these shelters as well. And also, although it's not on the slide, but the demand study would also address bicycle parking. Lighting would also be required, and it would be to provide adequate external lighting so that it would be consistent with the city's lighting ordinance, and also to provide safety and security in the exterior of the facility. And with respect to concentration of uses or the proximity of shelters from one another, the requirement is that no emergency or homeless shelter shall be within 300 feet from another, and that is a state law, a requirement that we cannot require these facilities to be more than that amount of feet from each other. So that is pursuant to state law. On-site management plans will be required for these facilities. The requirement is that management personnel be present at all times in the facility. Also, that the management plan be provided to and approved by the community development director. And also that the plan should address such things as hour of operation, on-site management and security, neighborhood relations, cooking, dining facilities, laundry, shower facilities, and smoking areas. And finally, there is a standard included, and it's actually part of the definition of emergency shelters, and it's with respect to ability to pay. And it basically does not allow anyone to be denied shelter if they cannot pay. And that are the standards. And our next steps would be for the Planning Commission to review and the amendments and forward their recommendation to council, as well as to subsequently return to council with your recommendations and the Planning Commission. So that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
So from here, whatever we decide, it goes back to Planning Commission?
Yes. From here, the Planning Commission will have an ability or an opportunity to review the amendments and provide their comments and recommendation to council as well.
All right. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to take a mandate from the state and figure out how best to apply it to the city.
Correct.
And this does not do, it doesn't author, well, I want to say author, it doesn't mean we've got shelters coming up. It just says this is if it ever happened, particularly if somebody on a private basis wanted to have a shelter, these are the rules they'd have to follow.
Correct.
Okay, and one of the things we're trying to determine is which zone or which zones this should be, and it could be as little as 1 cm or multiple ones as described here.
When we previously came to the city council, that was one of the options, is to just limit emergency shelters in the CM zone, or allow them wherever overnight accommodations are currently allowed. And
Right.
that the direction of city council was to take that approach.
Right. Would a single shelter, should somebody want to have one, satisfy the requirements for future shelters in the city? I'm just trying to see over the horizon, because I think some people might be worried, myself included, that this could mean we'd have multiple shelters. So with the approval of, or with the creation of a single shelter, would that fulfill our need under SB2?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, SB2 simply requires the city to identify at least one zone
Right.
where the emergency shelters are an allowed use without a conditional use permit.
Right.
As to whether or not a single shelter or multiple shelters would satisfy the city's need to demonstrate that we have the ability within our zoning to accommodate the needs for emergency shelters is another question that is actually part of the housing element review process that is conducted by the Department of Housing and Community Development. So that's a housing element issue.
Okay.
Simply today is whether or not to identify a single zone or multiple zones where emergency shelters, as defined in the proposed ordinance, would be allowed without the need for a conditional use permit.
Okay, and how would a shelter be created? What's the process? Is it is it somebody has to privately finance it, or what? What are we looking at here?
At this point, the ordinance is anticipating the private development of shelters. It also could be done by the city. I have not heard that the city has any intentions of operating an emergency shelter,
Right.
and another jurisdiction could conceivably apply, but their application would be treated just like a private developer's application as well.
Well, I'd be interested to know what my fellow members think of, do we want multiple zones or the single zone? I mean, I haven't really decided on that one, and I want to know what you all think. Thank you.
I know Ms. Murillo has some questions.
It looked like our city attorney had something to say. I didn't want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Mr. Benson's response that your November 12, 2013 staff report that's in the packet says that at a peak you've got about 1,050 beds currently, and the housing element calls for about 1,350. So you're about 300 short of what the housing element wants you to have.
Thank you. How did you arrive at the 10 square feet per bed for a waiting and intake area? That seems like a lot of space to me for waiting and intake, but if you thought it out, I'm interested to know.
Actually, in doing a review of other jurisdictions, this particular standard, if you will, came, we saw that's what was applied, and it was basically meant to make sure that there was adequate space within a facility to do the intake and have a waiting area. And of course, it's up for discussion. If 10 square feet per bed seems like it might be too much, then we're open to changing that. That was just something that I saw in reviewing other jurisdictions, and I think their concern that there be adequate space within the building to provide this service.
I'm thinking it would depend on the emergency, and so if it's like climate change goes crazy and there's some disaster, so that was another part. It's applied to the Red Cross and for when there's emergency shelter. So I'm just in like a disaster. I'm thinking of those disaster movies. I don't think it's going to matter if people are waiting outside or what the intake area is, but sorry.
And it would. Well, I'm thinking that it would not apply to a Red Cross because usually they have more supportive services than what would be allowed with this particular program.
Okay. Then my other question is the 300-foot radius of exclusion. Would that include Casa Esperanza Transition House and the Rescue Mission? Would there be a 300-foot around them?
I believe that was the intent, is to include existing homeless shelters as well.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, yes, the section regarding the concentration of uses refers to not only, it says that no emergency shelter or homeless shelter, so that would be a shelter that would not qualify as having the minimal supportive services. In other words, emergency shelter by definition has minimal supportive services. Okay. It's intended to be a limited amount. That's if you have services that exceed the definition of minimal supportive services. In other words, you're providing more services for your residents, or you're providing services to people who do not reside in the emergency shelter, that those shelters would fall under the definition of homeless shelter in this case. And in either case, the 300-foot circles or bubbles, the distance of separation would apply to either kind of shelter, either emergency shelter or homeless shelter.
And may I request a map, maybe when it comes back to City Council, maybe the Planning Commission would appreciate it, if we could see, because it seems like looking at the map, that will exclude some areas. The rescue mission seems, they're all down in that zone, and so that'll exclude some area, and it's, I think, worth a visual so we can see what that looks like. So I'm just going to confess that I have not read SB2. So is it meant for disasters? Is it meant for, we already have our warming centers, and so I think that would get to what Councilmember Hotchkiss was asking. What's it going to look like? Is it going to be shelters sprouting up everywhere? It depends on the impetus, right?
Well, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, first off, I would say is that this ordinance is addressing full-time shelters. The term emergency may be a misnomer in the sense that it sounds like it is responding to a disaster, but really the term emergency shelter from the Health and Safety Code definition is that it is temporary in nature for that resident, yet it would be permanent in the shelter's existence. In other words, I would describe the term emergency shelter as it's been taken from the Health and Safety Code to apply to essentially the Casa Esperanza's 100-bed or the 200-bed winter season. They provide 200 beds. They provide a reduced amount of services to the full 200 persons who might occupy those beds, whereas their year-long 100-bed transitional program, those persons receive greater amount of service. So the term emergency shelter really refers to the fact that it is a temporary stay for that individual that has a minimum amount of services associated with the residency, but that the facility itself would be permanent in nature, as opposed to, as the example you were describing, a Red Cross emergency shelter. That is what I would describe as a temporary use associated specifically with a disaster. Quite honestly, those Red Cross shelters are so temporary in use, they wouldn't even get through the application process before the disaster is done and that shelter is closed. So,
thank you. Now, Mr. Hotchkiss, I would suggest a wider area to accommodate more smaller shelters. Because if we've heard the community discussion about the one big shelter and the impacts to the neighborhood, there's been discussion that there's needy people all over the community, and that every community has to do its part. So I think you were asking if there should be one big shelter, and I like the map where it's kind of spread out, and depending on what the needs are, maybe two smaller would be better for the community than one big one.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Those are my thoughts.
Well, there really can't be one big one because it's limited in size by SB2. So that isn't an issue. The question is really
Right,
where
and we're
should,
planning for 300, if that's what's right.
Well, let me intercede
We're short
about that number,
300.
just because
the 100-bed limit.
those numbers come from the 2009 census. Is that correct? As I read the CAR about the 1,300?
Right, the 1,300 come from our housing element that we prepared in 2010.
Okay, because I did the common ground count in 2010. I did the one thereafter, and we had this declining number. So the number floats. It's a little bit of conjecture, frankly, about what we have in inventory. And I know that we're fighting a state mandate here, so I understand all that. But in terms of the credits and what we need to do, and our transitional housing capacity with our housing authority, all the things that we do in this community already has brought people to question, what are we doing now? And I know what the intent, or I hear what the intent of the law is, but the application is going to be a heap and helping of NIMBYism And we all know that going in. And we also learned some lessons from the now transition of Casa Esperanza from what it was to what it is and what all that meant. And I realize it's a slightly different situation. In this application, and this is something I really want to understand officially, is there any kind of residency requirement or anything that says you are from this county, city, or you are passing through? Is there anything that is restrictive along those lines? Or could there be? Mr. Vincent, maybe you have a handle on that.
The first answer is no. There's no proposal regarding a residency requirement. And really, by the fact that a person is here, I mean, a person, we already have the homeless shelters that we have and the proposed homeless shelters that could be built under this program would be responding to persons who are already here. They would either be sheltered or they would not. And so, but this ordinance does not include a residency requirement.
Right. Well, I realize that, and I realize that's the intent and the spirit of it, but we also know that there are almost hostile-like uses for these facilities, and I don't know how to prevent that or if there is a way to prevent that or control that. But once again, as we propose this to the general community about we're going to zone for, and I don't know if a more restrictive zone or a broader zone is more beneficial as far as how this works out. But I do know there's concerns out there, and I would like to be able to address them in a cogent manner. I'm not really sure how to do that, because I mean we're under the auspices of the state, so I don't know what if they're. Mr. Lebanon, maybe you have a thought on that.
Yes, thank you. You should keep in mind as you consider the options here that the standards for development are very clearly spelled out in terms of what we can and we can't require. So, for example, being able to require residency, that's definitely not one of the things that we could require. So it's very highly regulated, and I think we addressed each one of those point by point in terms of the management plan, the waiting areas, hours of operation, et cetera, the distances between. That's about the leeway you have to work with.
And could there be, for example, and I'm just using this from my personal experience of having done the outreach on the street, could somebody come and stay for 3 months, leave, come back 2 months later and stay again? Under these rules, I'm saying that you're not making up the rules, obviously, but I'm just kind of wondering about this general thing because that was definitely something that was happening in the population that I got to interview, and I just didn't know if there was some way to put us more in our comfort zone about what we may or may not develop and where we're going to develop this.
I suppose that could be spelled out in the management plan in terms of, how long somebody had to stay away before they could come back and resume their stay at the shelter.
But there wouldn't be the ability to have sobriety requirements or anything along those lines.
Again, I think we're pretty constrained there.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I just would add one other point is that the backdrop of this, one thing is to deal with SB2, which is identifying this zone, but you have to remember that it's in the backdrop of the requirements of the housing element to show that we have the zoning that is able to accommodate the defined need for transient or homeless sheltering. And so the more restrictions you start placing on who can take advantage of these shelters, whether it be sobriety or residency requirements and so forth, you start chipping away at who can qualify for the shelter, and then the Department of Housing and Community Development is going to look askew toward your housing element saying you have too many restrictions. It's not likely that you're going to be able to satisfy your homeless sheltering need because so few of your homeless qualify once you have all of these restrictions.
And I understand that, and I had to ask because basically I've had a lot of constituents ask these very same questions. So, Mr. Hotchkiss.
See, I think this bill was put through because there were cities that were making the zoning requirements so strict that there wasn't going to be a chance for any shelter, correct? All right, so they threw a big net out and we're sort of caught in it. but I hear what Mr. Rouse is saying. We don't want to put out the welcome mat for people that are just going to come and live off of the kindness of Santa Barbara to the degradation of our city unfairly. We'd like to help people that really want to be helped. So I would just suggest to Ms. Murillo that maybe we should restrict this area but satisfy the requirement, in which case it would be counter to what the council said before, that it should be limited to the CM area. I put that out for your consideration. I actually would make a motion in that regard if there was a second.
Well, let me argue against that, because I'm thinking, woe to the entity that's going to propose a new homeless shelter. The issue is so charged, and even to hear your language today about the welcome mat and people taking advantage of Santa Barbara, there's people are homeless because they can't work or they have mental disabilities, and I'd like to start the conversation from, let's make the space available, and it's going to be really tough to locate a new homeless shelter. The more space we have, the more chance we can get one to satisfy the law and to accommodate the needs of street people and people with other challenges. And I think we have enough, Mr. Ledbetter, in terms of community development. There's so many hoops someone would have to go through, right, to establish a new shelter, and the public would certainly be watching, and our city council members would be on guard. I think more space, the better, to satisfy the law, and then maybe to get to the goal.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Am I correct in saying that the staff determined that the CM zone satisfied the requirements of SB2?
Yes, that is correct. Our current housing element actually did the analysis with respect to the CM zone, the number of parcels available, and the development potential, and the state did certify our housing element. So.
Oh, cool. All right, great.
Well, I'd have to say that you're both right. I mean, there are reasons for homelessness, and we do also have a track record of people having used this as a way station and a hostel. So we've got both situations, and we don't have that much control over how that works. But I have to agree with one point that you made, Ms. Murillo, that it may be better to have a broader zone where smaller units can go in than to try to have one larger facility or even something as big as 100 beds in one spot. But I also went through that thing in the neighborhoods with the sobering center, which are also allowed by state law without CUP and whatnot. And let's face it, the residents have an expectation, or sort of commercial property owners, of what their conditions and use of their properties and surrounding neighbors are when they buy that property. So, but I think for the purposes going forward, which we have to do, and the timing we have to have, I am probably going to support option one, which is a broader zone. Now, of course, in option one, the way staff has it listed, you still have Ocean Commercial involved in that. Is that, and you were recommended against that because of the LCP?
Correct.
And was that something that came up after you guys wrote the CAR? Or?
That's correct.
Okay.
So the 4 zones that were shown on the slide with respect to not having them as part of these amendments would.
And is that because even if it was included in this greater ordinance, but that portion of it wasn't in compliance, would that throw the whole thing out, or is it? I mean, because at some point in time, once the LCP is completed, it can be incorporated.
That could be.
But is it better to take it out of
It'd
there
be better
now?
to take it out now.
Okay, Mr. Vincent.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I mean, to speak to that point, if we find that we want to add additional zones, those could be added at the time that the LCP amendments are proposed to the City Council and then presented to the Coastal Commission for certification.
Okay.
May I, Mr. Chair, were you referring to sober houses, residential houses of sober Sober living houses?
I was talking about a state mandate that a lot of folks weren't aware of. And so they exist all over the city, and they've existed quietly for 30 years, which is a good thing.
Right, some of them don't have problems. And,
Right, but
and
some-
I'm sorry, I just need to stick up for sober houses too.
Well, that's great. We're not
I mean,
talking
those
about
are,
that
but
today,
those are
but-
places where people have a residential comfort and they get sober. So the state is right to put these rules on us.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we would be buffeted around by NIMBYism, as you yourself referred to. And
Right.
so I'm sorry, I'm connected to the recovery community, and I feel
But that's
like
great, but we're
I
not
have-
doing that today.
Right,
and
but you had your say, and so I had mine.
Well, okay, let's be done with that then.
And I agree with you about option one. So I shouldn't rag you if we're agreeing. Okay.
That'd be point taken.
So, but
Don't rag the chair. All right. And then I had, so very briefly then, a proposed development goes through the normal procedure of, size, bulk, scale, parking, a planning commission, or is that going to depend on the size?
Typically, it would not go through unless it was required a use permit. That's the whole point, is that it would be it wouldn't be a discretionary decision. You'd simply have to meet the standards of review. Now, the community development director would look at the management plan. The design review boards would look at the architecture of it, and they'd have to submit a parking plan, those sort of things. But the idea is that the intent of SB2 is to take out the discretionary part of it.
And so surrounding stakeholders would not have an appeal, is that correct?
Mr. Chair, the only appeal that would be available would be of a design review approval if one was required.
Right, because there's no CUPs, there's no use in that.
That's
Okay,
correct.
got it. All right, very good. Would anybody like to make a motion?
he made one and there was no second.
Okay, so that died for a second. Would you like to state another motion?
I move that we go for option one, and so staff's recommendation, excluding some of those, whatever they were.
OCRH.
OC and OM1, right, OC1. Okay, that was a messy motion.
There we are.
I move that we do, I move that we recommend to the Planning Commission and the City Council to consider the zoning as laid out by staff.
Okay, I'll second that. Any discussion? Okay, all
My
in,
microphone was off. Oh, shoot. Okay.
doesn't count then. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
2-1. Carries. And we are done. Thank you, staff.